It began with rage. Inside the cold walls of the Führer's headquarters, the air itself seemed to shrink under the weight of Adolf Hitler's voice. He was shouting, a raw, animal sound bouncing off concrete. Officers stood frozen, their faces pale, eyes fixed forward, as if by refusing to move they could avoid being seen. In December 1941, Germany's dream of a lightning war had burned away. The Wehrmacht was stalled outside Moscow. Snow and blood buried the myth of invincibility. And in the West, Hitler had just received word that the United States, a nation he once dismissed as soft, materialistic and racially mixed, had declared war. He turned on his generals, screaming, "It's impossible. America can't fight a real war. They're businessmen, not soldiers." His words trembled not from doubt but from disbelief, disbelief born from reports, numbers and confident assurances that had long confirmed what he wanted to hear, that the United States lacked the will, the unity and above all, the capacity to wage a total war. Those assurances had come from within his own intelligence network. One man, one report, a web of misinformation that comforted the Führer and condemned millions. This is the story of the spy who misled the Reich, the numbers that deceived a dictator, and the empire that collapsed under the weight of its own illusions. Before we go further, if you're fascinated by the hidden failures behind the world's darkest chapters, subscribe to this channel. You'll help us uncover more forgotten truths that still shape our world today. Now, back to that room, 1941. When Hitler slammed his fist on the table, he wasn't just raging at his enemies. He was raging at reality. 4 years, he'd built an empire on ideology, the belief that willpower and racial destiny could bend the laws of economics, geography, and human endurance. And to maintain that illusion, the Reich needed information that confirmed the dream, not facts that challenged it. That's where the spy came in. His name was Dr. Gerd H. Meyer, a well-connected economist and intelligence asset of the WWII, Germany's military intelligence service. In the late 1930s, Meyer had been stationed in the United States, tasked with evaluating America's industrial potential in the event of war. His findings would shape German strategic thinking for years. Meyer's reports, written in calm academic language, painted a picture of an America divided and disorganized. He argued that while the U.S. possessed immense industrial capacity on paper, it was constrained by bureaucracy, labor unions, and political paralysis. According to his estimates, even with full mobilization, the United States could not produce more than 3,000 aircraft a year, far below the levels needed for sustained warfare. He wrote that, "American factories are vast but their spirit is weak. Their people are consumers, not producers. They will tire before they sacrifice." When the reports reached Berlin, they were met not with skepticism but satisfaction. Hitler himself annotated one of them, underlining the phrase "spirit is weak," and adding a note in the margin, "Exactly." By 1939, as the Nazi war machine prepared for its conquest of Europe, those numbers became part of a larger myth, the myth of an industrial titan asleep under layers of decadence and democracy. A myth that comforted the Führer and poisoned his strategy. Reality, however, was already moving faster than his ideology could comprehend. While Meyer dined in German diplomatic circles in New York, American engineers in Detroit were retooling their factories for something unimaginable in peacetime. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, the titans of consumerism, were already experimenting with mass production techniques for aircraft engines, tanks, and jeeps. Quietly, the blueprints of total war were being drawn up. But Berlin didn't see it. By 1940, as Europe fell, Hitler's confidence grew. France had surrendered in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone. And in that summer of triumph, another of Meyer's reports landed on his desk, this one predicting that if the United States did enter the war, it would take them at least 4 years to reach an effective level of military production. 4 years. It was the perfect number. Long enough for the Reich to finish off Britain, secure the Soviet territories, and dictate peace before America could interfere. So when Hitler ordered Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in June 1941, he did it under the assumption that the United States would remain a distant echo. Industrially impotent. Militarily unprepared. The world, he believed, would be German before America could even wake. But the numbers were wrong. By the time Meyer's last memo reached Berlin, the United States had already begun the most massive industrial mobilization in human history. In a single year, America would produce over 24,000 aircraft, 25,000 tanks, and 50,000 artillery pieces. Factories that once made cars were now rolling out bombers. Women who once sold cosmetics were riveting steel. The so-called nation of consumers was turning into the arsenal of democracy. None of this appeared in the reports on Hitler's desk. In the winter of 1941, when the Wehrmacht froze outside Moscow and Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor, Hitler's myth collided with the truth. He gathered his high command at the Wolf's Lair, his secret headquarters in East Prussia. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fury. The news from the Eastern Front was catastrophic. The Soviets were counterattacking and German supply lines were collapsing. Yet the more grim the situation became, the more Hitler clung to his illusions. He ranted that Roosevelt's America was a hollow colossus, that its industry was dependent on Jewish bankers and weak workers, that its entry into the war was an act of desperation, not power. But his generals knew the truth. Intelligence from neutral Switzerland, intercepted radio traffic, and reports from German trade attaches all pointed to the same, terrifying conclusion. The United States was ramping up production on a scale no nation had ever achieved. One general tried to speak, to explain that America's industrial base was turning out bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. Hitler cut him off. "Nonsense," he barked. "They are bluffing. They always bluff." But the bluff was real. In secret war plants across the Midwest, entire cities were being reborn. Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, the beating heart of American steel, thundered day and night. Assembly lines that once ended with convertibles now ended with Sherman tanks. Shipyards on the coasts built Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. America was not asleep. It was awakening into a force that no ideology could match. Inside the Reich, however, truth was treason. The Abwehr, the same agency that had sent Meyer to America, was losing Hitler's trust. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, its head, knew that the Führer's belief in the spies' old reports had become a danger to the war effort. But to contradict them openly was suicide. So the illusion continued. Reports were rewritten, numbers adjusted, and language softened to match the leader's worldview. Hitler no longer wanted intelligence. He wanted confirmation. By 1942, that confirmation would cost Germany everything. In Berlin, propaganda films still portrayed American soldiers as clumsy, overweight, and ill-equipped. Newspapers described Roosevelt as a puppet, and American industry as chaotic. But the soldiers on the front lines, the tank crews at Kursk, the Luftwaffe pilots over the Atlantic, were beginning to whisper the unthinkable. The Americans had more planes, more tanks, more trucks, more everything. Even the skies began to tell the truth. In late 1942, German radar operators began tracking waves of bombers unlike anything they had seen before. Hundreds at a time, flying in tight formations, escorted by long-range fighters. Factories in the Ruhr burned under the thunder of industrial might that Hitler had dismissed as fantasy. And still he refused to believe it. "Impossible," he muttered, staring at the damage reports. "They must be British planes using American markings." But deep inside, a different realization was forming, one that would haunt him until his final days. The empire he had built on ideology was collapsing under the weight of mathematics. For all his speeches about destiny, for all his faith in willpower and race, he could not outproduce an enemy he had once called weak. The man who built his world on lies was now imprisoned by one. By early 1942, as the Red Army pushed west and Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic with endless supplies, Hitler's rage became his only constant. He screamed at generals, fired ministers, replaced commanders, but the numbers did not change. The United States was outbuilding Germany at a ratio of 6-1. And the man who had told him it could never happen, the spy who fed the delusion, had vanished. To the Abwehr, Gerd Meyer was no longer useful. His reports had become evidence of failure. Somewhere in Europe, his name disappeared from the archives. Some said he was reassigned to the Eastern Front. Others whispered he was quietly executed. No record survives. Only the consequences do. Because in the end, the war that Hitler believed he could win with ideology was lost by arithmetic. And yet even then he refused to see it. He told his ministers that American production numbers were Jewish propaganda. He dismissed photographs of assembly lines as fabrications. "They are cartoons," he said, "drawn to frighten the weak." But history doesn't bend to belief. It crushes it. As 1942 dragged on, the Nazi dream, of domination through will, began to unravel. The factories of America had become a second front, one that could not be bombed, one that could not be conquered. And in that quiet truth lies the most devastating irony of all. The spy who failed Hitler did not serve the Allies, nor the resistance. He served reality itself. By the spring of 1942, the illusion was cracking. Factories in Germany were running at full speed, but they were producing less than half of what the Führer had been promised. The myth of German efficiency, a myth built on propaganda and fear, was collapsing under its own impossible standards. Inside the Reich Chancellery, the meetings were darker now. The smoke from Hitler's cigarettes hung low in the room as Albert Speer, the newly appointed armaments minister, laid out production charts on the marble table. The lines told a story that no one dared to read aloud. America's aircraft production had already surpassed 40,000 units a year. Germany stood at less than 12,000. The United States was building one bomber every 63 minutes. The Reich, one every 4 hours. When Speer spoke, he did so cautiously. "My Führer," he said, "we have underestimated the industrial tempo of the Americans." Hitler's eyes flicked up from the numbers. For a moment, the room was silent. Then came the familiar tone, a voice steeped in denial. "Nonsense. The figures are lies. Do you not understand, Speer? These Americans, they have no spirit. You can't mass-produce morale." Speer didn't answer. He simply watched as Hitler crossed out entire columns of the report with his pencil. He'd seen it before. When bad news arrived, Hitler erased it both on paper and in his mind. He had built a world where ideology outranked evidence. That night, Speer wrote in his private notes that Germany was fighting an enemy we have not yet begun to comprehend, an enemy of machines, men, and will combined. But in Berlin, comprehension was treason. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was even less willing to face the truth. His air force, once the pride of the Reich, was bleeding aircraft faster than they could be replaced. Yet he continued to boast that his squadrons would wipe the American air fleets from the sky. At one meeting, when a general presented data showing that U.S. bomber production would double again by year's end, Göring laughed. "Then let them come," he said. "We'll shoot them down faster than they can build them." He didn't believe it, but he needed to say it. To do otherwise was to risk Hitler's wrath. The spies' lies had become more than intelligence errors. They had become doctrine. In the archives of the WWII, the original memoranda still sat on file, carefully written, confidently phrased, utterly wrong. The estimates of American industrial output, population mobilization, and logistics capacity were off by a factor of 5. And yet those same figures were still used in briefings, still quoted in speeches, still shaping strategy. When Meyer's final report from 1940 had claimed that the U.S. could not mobilize more than 3 million men, the number had sounded reassuring. In truth, by 1942, America had already trained over 6 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Every number Hitler believed had turned to dust. And with each new defeat, his anger grew. In June 1942, as the German Sixth Army pushed toward Stalingrad, Hitler addressed his generals with manic certainty. "Once we have the oil of the Caucasus," he said, "the Americans will collapse. They cannot maintain their machines without our fuel." He was wrong again. Even as German tanks stalled in the steppe, American factories were producing synthetic fuel by the millions of gallons, using technology that the Reich had once considered inferior. The war of ideology had become a war of chemistry, and Germany was losing that too. Back in Washington, President Roosevelt had called it the arsenal of democracy. But to the men inside Hitler's bunker, it was something else entirely, a nightmare of abundance. German spies who had once boasted of American weakness were now silent. Some were dead. Some had vanished. And others, those who had told the truth, were arrested for defeatism. The most tragic irony was that the WWII itself had seen this coming. Admiral Canaris, who had overseen Meyer's mission years earlier, now kept a secret file of reports that contradicted the Führer's delusions. It included intercepted trade data, economic analyses from neutral nations, and even aerial reconnaissance of American shipyards. The evidence was overwhelming. The United States was not just a rival, it was a machine designed to win. But when Canaris tried to present this to the high command, the doors were closed. Göring called it enemy propaganda. Hitler called it Jewish mathematics. The failure was not one of intelligence. It was a failure of belief. Every totalitarian system requires faith. Faith in its leader, in its ideology, in the lie that holds it together. For Hitler, that faith was absolute. And when reality contradicted it, he did not change the ideology. He changed the reality, or tried to. That summer, while Allied bombers were darkening the skies over Europe, Hitler issued one of his strangest orders: a ban on all comparisons between German and American production figures. From that day forward, the official stance of the Reich was simple: American output is exaggerated by foreign agitators. The propaganda ministry followed obediently. Posters appeared in factories showing caricatures of lazy American workers and broken machines. Radio broadcasts mocked Roosevelt's Rust Empire. But the workers in those German factories knew the truth. They were running out of steel, coal, and rest. Their nights were broken by sirens. They had seen the photographs smuggled from the West, rows upon rows of B-17s glinting under the American sun, endless fields of tanks ready to move. One engineer in Hamburg later recalled, "We joked that for every plane we built, the Americans built a city." And the laughter always ended in silence. By autumn, Speer began to push for reforms: longer shifts, centralized control, the merging of private industry under a single war economy. But it was too late. Germany's industrial structure was collapsing under inefficiency, sabotage, and Allied bombing. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Henry Ford was walking through his new bomber plant at Willow Run, the largest factory on Earth. It stretched nearly a mile long, filled with tens of thousands of workers, each performing a single motion, perfectly timed, perfectly measured. At its peak, Willow Run produced one B-24 bomber every 55 minutes. 55 minutes to build a machine that could cross the Atlantic, drop 8 tons of explosives, and return home. In the same hour, German factories managed one fighter plane. The numbers told the story even if Hitler refused to hear it. By late 1942, the illusion was no longer sustainable. German officers began to whisper about the American tide, the unstoppable flood of material that would eventually drown Europe. And in those whispers the name of the spy returned. "Who gave us those numbers?" one colonel asked another. "Who told the Führer America was weak?" But there was no answer. Meyer had become a ghost. In the archives his name was struck out. His reports reclassified. It was as if the Reich itself was trying to erase its own lie. Speer later wrote that by the end of 1942, Hitler no longer wanted to see statistics. He wanted to see faith. Faith in the impossible. Faith that the 1,000-year Reich could survive the arithmetic of steel. And so, as the Americans built ships faster than Germany could sink them, and planes faster than Germany could shoot them down, Hitler retreated deeper into fantasy. He dreamed of new superweapons, of miracle jets, of vengeance rockets that would somehow reverse the tide. But no miracle can undo mathematics. The spies' false numbers had become prophecy, and the Führer believed them until the very end. In the dark winter of 1942, as Stalingrad turned to ruin, a single truth echoed through the frozen steppe: ideology can inspire men to fight, but it cannot forge steel or fuel tanks or feed armies. It was not betrayal that doomed Hitler. It was belief. The belief that willpower could replace reality. And in the end, that belief was the most destructive weapon he ever possessed. By early 1943, Berlin had stopped pretending. The truth could no longer be hidden behind numbers or speeches. The snow-covered ruins of Stalingrad had made it visible to everyone. Generals, civilians, even the men in the propaganda ministry. For the first time, the German people began to sense that something fundamental had broken. The radio still spoke of victory. The newspapers still printed optimism. But in every household there was silence after the broadcasts. Silence and fear. Inside the Führer bunker, the same silence waited between Hitler's rants. His health was failing. His hands trembled, his voice cracked, but his certainty never wavered. He believed Germany had lost not because its factories were outproduced, but because its people had lost faith. He called it the spiritual crisis. Albert Speer called it madness. In February 1943, Speer presented another production report. The figures were stark. American aircraft output now exceeded 60,000 per year. British industry added another 30,000. Together, the Allies were producing more planes in a month than Germany could in a quarter. Speer spoke softly. "Mein Führer, if we are to survive, we must face reality. We cannot match their numbers, but we can adapt. We must focus on quality, on new designs, on jets. Hitler cut him off. Quality? Nonsense. We don't need more machines. We need more faith. You think too much like an engineer, Speer. The Americans are fighting for money. We fight for destiny. Destiny. The word hung in the air like smoke. For years, that idea had driven everything. The conquests, the genocide, the blind obedience. But now, destiny was collapsing under the roar of engines thousands of miles away. In the skies over Germany, American bombers were rewriting the meaning of war. Day after day, hundreds of silver aircraft appeared over the horizon, steady, endless, relentless. The sirens wailed, the sky darkened, and the earth shook beneath the fall of iron and fire. For those below, it felt less like war and more like judgment. Entire cities became targets. Hamburg burned for 7 days. Cologne vanished beneath waves of explosions. Dresden later would follow. Each bomb crater was a monument to the failure of the Führer's illusions. But even as the Reich crumbled, Hitler demanded reports, not of destruction but of miracles. He wanted proof that Germany was still strong. He wanted news that factories had survived, that morale was high, that new weapons would soon reverse everything. And so that's what he received. His ministers filtered every truth through the lens of ideology. When production fell, they blamed sabotage. When bombings destroyed factories, they called it temporary. When coal ran out, they said new reserves were being found. In one meeting, Joseph Goebbels assured him that the spirit of the people is unbreakable. Hitler smiled. He needed to believe it. He never saw the faces of those same people, standing in breadlines under falling ash, their eyes hollow, their homes gone. He never saw the workers trudging to factories without roofs, the engineers salvaging parts from wreckage, the children shivering in the underground tunnels that had become their world. The Führer lived in a fiction of numbers, a fiction born from a single spy's lie, nourished by years of self-deception. Meanwhile, Albert Speer fought a private war, not against the Allies but against the bureaucracy of delusion. He centralized the factories, streamlined production, and introduced the total war economy. For a moment it worked. In mid-1943, German arms production actually rose. The propaganda machine celebrated it as proof that the Reich was recovering. But the truth was simpler. Germany was producing more weapons because it was sacrificing everything else: housing, food, and human life. Speer himself later wrote, "We were building guns in exchange for civilization." Outside Germany, the Allies were building an empire of logistics. Every ship that left an American port carried more than weapons. It carried time. Time for Britain to breathe. Time for Russia to fight. Time for history to decide. And that time was running out for the Reich. As Speer pushed for rational planning, Hitler turned to mysticism. He began to quote ancient prophecies, to speak of fate and divine punishment. Providence, he said, will not abandon Germany. But Providence had already chosen its side. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Within weeks, Mussolini's regime collapsed. Hitler called it betrayal. To Speer and the generals, it was gravity. The weight of reality was finally pulling the empire down. Inside the wolf's lair, the atmosphere turned poisonous. Reports arrived from every front. The U-boats were being hunted, the Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Americans were landing in Italy. Yet Hitler still demanded that his commanders believe. One colonel dared to speak plainly. "Mein Führer, the Americans are producing tanks faster than we can destroy them. Their resources are endless." Hitler's face went pale, then red. "Lies," he shouted. "The Americans have no steel without our iron ore. Their economy will collapse by winter. Their statistics are fantasies, the same Jewish fantasies that infected Meyer's mind years ago." The name returned like a ghost. Meyer, the economist, the spy, the man who had once assured the Reich that America was too divided, too decadent to fight. Some of the officers still remembered his reports. They remembered how confident he had sounded, how pleased Hitler had been to read them. But now no one spoke of him. In the secret corridors of the Abwehr, his name was forbidden. To mention him was to mention failure. Yet his shadow lingered in every decision, every speech, every order given too late. Because at its core, the lie that Meyer had written was the same lie the Führer had lived. That belief could replace reality. And now that lie was killing Germany. By late 1943, Allied bombers were reaching Berlin regularly. The capital of the Reich, once the showcase of Nazi grandeur, was being reduced to dust. The city's lights were extinguished, the streets filled with rubble. Yet Hitler continued to meet his ministers in rooms lit by chandeliers and lined with maps that no longer reflected the world outside. He pointed to the front lines with shaking hands, tracing movements of divisions that no longer existed. "We will retake Kharkov," he said. "Then Kursk. Then Moscow." The generals knew it was impossible. But they nodded. To disagree was to die. Even Speer, who had once dared to argue, had learned to remain silent. In his memoirs he would later confess, "We were not just serving a dictator. We were serving a delusion." At the same time, across the Atlantic, Roosevelt's advisors discussed production quotas in the calm light of Washington offices. Charts covered the walls: planes, ships, tanks, trucks. The scale was staggering. America had become what Hitler's ideology could never comprehend: a democracy efficient enough to outproduce a dictatorship. The contrast was total. In Germany, orders were dictated by rage. In America, by data. In Germany, truth was filtered through fear. In America, through debate. In Germany, ideology demanded faith. In America, reality demanded proof. And proof was winning the war. By the end of 1943, Germany's industrial output began to fall again. Allied bombers had destroyed key factories in the Ruhr. Coal production dropped. Rail networks collapsed. Hitler responded with a single command: no retreat, no surrender. Total war. But total war required total reality, and he no longer had it. The propaganda posters now looked desperate, almost hysterical. "Victory or death," they read. But the workers reading them knew the truth. Their rations were gone. Their homes were gone. Their sons were gone. The Führer's empire had become a shell, loud, empty, hollow. Yet even then, deep beneath Berlin, he continued to demand reports, charts, maps, all doctored to soothe his ideology. He believed what he needed to believe, and that belief isolated him completely from the world he claimed to control. It was not the enemy that blinded him. It was conviction. The Reich had built itself on faith in one man's vision, and now that vision could no longer see. And so, in the winter of 1943, as snow fell over a shattered continent, the dream of the 1,000-year Reich entered its final stage: not decline but delusion. The war of ideology was ending the only way it could, not with revelation but with ruin. By 1944, the empire that once promised 1,000 years was living minute to minute. Bombs fell like clockwork. The sirens no longer startled anyone, they were part of daily life. Mothers led their children into cellars as calmly as they once led them to school. Berlin had become a city of shadows, not conquered yet but already defeated. And yet, inside the bunker, the Führer still dreamed of victory. His maps no longer showed the world as it was. The thick black lines of the front had been redrawn with impossible optimism. Divisions that had ceased to exist weeks ago were still marked in ink. On some nights, he spoke of counterattacks led by phantom armies. He believed the war could still be won, through sheer will, through destiny, through some final revelation that would prove the world wrong. It was not insanity that blinded him. It was conviction. By then, the American industrial machine had reached its full power. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, 17 million tons of shipping, and over 25,000 tanks. The Detroit factories ran 24 hours a day, the assembly lines moving like rivers of steel. In one speech, Roosevelt called it the miracle of democracy. To Hitler, it was blasphemy. He could not comprehend how a nation he considered weak, mongrelized, corrupted, soft, could outproduce the Reich that had conquered Europe. The answer lay in something he could never understand: truth without fear. In America, reality was not punished. It was measured. Every mistake led to an improvement, every failure became data, every criticism fueled change. The German system, by contrast, punished truth like treason. And so, each lie piled upon another until the whole structure collapsed under its own weight. Albert Speer saw it coming. In his reports that year, he began to omit the word victory. He wrote instead about stabilization, about delaying defeat. But even those cautious phrases were dangerous. When Hitler read them, he accused Speer of defeatism. "You've lost your faith," he said. "You've forgotten the power of the German spirit." Speer didn't argue. He knew the spirit had been burned to ash. That spring, A strange rumor began to circulate through the ranks of German intelligence. Whispers of the spy who had started it all. Someone claimed to have found fragments of old WWII files, burned but still legible. Among them were reports signed by Dr. Gerd H. Meyer. The same name that had once calmed Hitler's fears, now resurfaced like a curse. Some said Meyer had fled to Switzerland. Others believed he was still in Berlin, hiding under a false name. But no one could find him. It didn't matter anymore. His ghost had already done its work. The lie he wrote, that the United States was weak, divided, and unprepared, had outlived him, had shaped strategy, had doomed armies, and had given birth to an empire of delusion. In one of the surviving memos, the line that most pleased Hitler was underlined twice. America lacks the soul for total war. 4 years later, America had built the greatest war machine in history. Soul, it turned out, was not what Germany lacked in others, it was what it had lost within itself. By mid-1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, Hitler still clung to fantasies. He imagined divisions that would rise from the ruins, secret weapons that would turn defeat into victory, allies that would return at the last moment. The reality outside his bunker told another story. The beaches of France were filled with tanks, trucks, and men, all stamped "Made in the USA." The industrial might he had denied now poured into Europe like an iron tide. The generals who once whispered about Meyer now whispered about survival. They knew that Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. Yet Hitler continued to talk about destiny. He spoke of ancient myths, of gods of war, of the fate of nations. History, he said, will remember who had the greater faith. Faith, that was all he had left. In July 1944, when an assassination attempt failed to kill him, he took it as proof of divine favor. Providence, he said, has spared me for victory. But Providence was silent. That same month, American factories produced more warplanes than Germany had in the entire previous year. Each bomber that took off from England carried within it the truth that Hitler had refused to see, the truth built by workers he had called weak, designed by minds he had called inferior, powered by an economy he had called decadent. Reality was not just winning the war. It was erasing the ideology that had denied it. The propaganda films now looked absurd. They showed smiling soldiers and perfect cities that no longer existed. They spoke of final triumph, even as Allied tanks rolled through France and Russian artillery closed in from the east. In the streets of Berlin, the people no longer listened. They were tired of belief. One survivor later said, "We had faith until there was nothing left to believe in but hunger." By autumn, Albert Speer visited the bombed ruins of Essen, once the industrial heart of Germany. The factories were gone, twisted metal, blackened earth. He stood there for a long time, silent. Then he said to his aide, "This is what faith without reason looks like." In that moment he understood what the Führer never could, that the failure of ideology is not sudden. It decays slowly, through denial, through repetition, through the comfort of lies that make reality bearable. The spy's lie had been simple, almost harmless. A miscalculation, a false estimate, a convenient reassurance. But like all lies told to power, it had multiplied, metastasized, until it became the foundation of an empire. And when that empire fell, the lie fell with it, but not before consuming everything built upon it. By December 1944, the Reich's last gamble began. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final attempt to prove that faith could still bend reality. The German army threw everything it had into the frozen forests of Belgium. For a few days it worked. The Allies reeled. The newspapers in Berlin screamed of a miracle. Hitler smiled again. "See," he told Speer. "They underestimate us. They always have. But miracles are short-lived." Within weeks, the American counterattack shattered the German lines. Thousands of men were lost. Thousands more surrendered. The fuel was gone, the ammunition spent. And still, Hitler blamed everyone but himself. He blamed his generals. He blamed the weather. He blamed fate. Never once did he blame the lie that had started it all, the comfortable fiction that had told him what he wanted to hear. The same fiction that had turned truth into treason, reason into weakness, and reality into an enemy. By the dawn of 1945, the Reich was collapsing from within. Cities lay in ruins, armies disintegrated, and even the most loyal officers began to admit what no one dared say aloud, that Germany had been defeated not by foreign armies, but by its own blindness. In the ruins of a burning continent, One idea remained: that ideology when it fears truth becomes suicide.